Good afternoon to those of you in the room and to those of you watching online. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Forum on Advancing Inclusive Climate Action in Foreign Policy and Development. We are coming off of a fantastic discussion hosted at the White House this morning and looking forward to deepening the conversation this afternoon with those of you here in the room with us and with those of you online. The session this morning was recorded and will be made available online shortly. I'm Lauren Reese, Director of the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. The Wilson Center is a special place for a number of reasons, but chief among them is our nonpartisanship. Our bipartisan Board of Trustees, appointed by the U.S. President to 6-year terms, reflects the nonpartisan and independent nature of our work. So today, it's my distinct privilege to introduce Bishop Leah Daughtry, Vice Chair of the Wilson Center's Board of Trustees, for welcoming remarks. Bishop Daughtry is also the National Presiding Prelate of the House of the Lord Churches and brings to this discussion a personal and professional commitment to issues related to justice and equity. Please help me welcome Bishop Daughtry to the floor.
Good afternoon. Now, I'm from the Talkback Church. So it's okay if you talk back to me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
That sounds like home. So thank you, Lauren, for your leadership and for the introduction. And on behalf of the Wilson Center and our collaborators for today's event at the White House and USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, this is my privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's forum on advancing inclusive climate change in foreign policy and development. I am Leah Daughtry, as Lauren has said, and it is my privilege to serve as Vice Chair of the Wilson Center's Board of Trustees and Chair of our Committee on Fellowships. That's the fun work, choosing the new fellows that come in every year. The Wilson Center is a scholarship-driven, nonpartisan think tank mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research to inform smart foreign policy. As a platform for thoughtful discourse, free from political bias, the Wilson Center strives to be a hub for developing solutions that are responsive to the lived experience of communities around the world and the issues facing decision makers, from a mayor in a small town to the head of a multilateral corporate institution. With programs that dive deep into every corner of the world and address today's most pressing issues, the Wilson Center is uniquely positioned to bring together diverse voices and identify those entry points for more effective and responsive decision-making. Today's forum is an example of the Center's commitment to inclusive and thoughtful dialogue on complex issues like climate change, foreign policy, and development. Through work spearheaded by the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, the Center has been a leader in understanding and distilling the complex linkages between environmental and climate change, global health, and demographic trends, and their impacts on human security and foreign policy. Core to this work has been the program's engagement with community leaders, civil society, and development and security practitioners, and ensuring a space in the DC policy community for those voices to inform responses. As you well know, so often policy is developed by people who don't live the policy and who don't have to deal with the impact and the effects of the policies that are made through regulatory process and in Capitol Hill. I'm from Brooklyn. We used to be a super fun cleanup site. So our children had to deal with the impact of asthma, of increased health challenges because of the environmental thing that was happening just down the block. And as they were making policy about that, nobody asked us about impact. Nobody asked us about what the cleanup would mean. Nobody asked us about how we felt about anything. Somebody, somewhere, came up with a solution and imposed it on us. And in our work at the Wilson Center, we're committed to bringing those impacted voices to the table to help inform and develop policies and programs that can then be responsive and be the most effective because they have been developed in partnership with those who live them. So we're excited about this work, and we're excited to have you here. And you can hear a sample of our program of work in this space by tuning into The Arc. It's a national security broadcast podcast series, and there you can learn more about what we do in this space. Now, this forum is really important, and we're so excited about specifically it being about inclusivity, because climate change has immediate impacts, and we in the United States see it here through the storms that have just come through. Back to back, I don't think we've ever had a storm season with so many storms, so intense in such a short period of time. And the importance of addressing this issue cannot be overstated. We are at a critical juncture. Climate change is no longer something over the horizon or something that happened someplace else. As we've seen in our own country, the impacts of climate change are real and are stressing economies and upending lives. And for those communities who have been marginalized or left out of decision-making in the past, the risks of climate change are even further pronounced, because it happens to be by happenstance or coincidence that many of the impacted communities in hurricane cities, many disenfranchised and marginalized communities happen to live through, I don't know how that happened, but they just happen to live on that coastline in coastal areas where there hasn't been that much attention to whether the levees are strong, to whether the foundations of the buildings have been properly inspected, are strong enough. Those people are the people who are impacted first and most deeply. Already, we've seen the impacts of climate change in making it more difficult for parents to feed their children. We see it forcing people to make difficult choices on whether to leave their land, and we see it compounding the impact of ongoing conflict in places like Sudan, where 25 million people don't have enough to eat. And Ukraine, where destruction of infrastructure means that crops aren't irrigated and people don't have the energy needed to stay cool in the summer or warm in the winter. While the risks posed by climate change are large, so are the opportunities to lay a more just, sustainable, and prosperous pathway forward in the transition to a renewable energy economy. But doing so demands inclusive decision-making. It demands the will to do it. And it requires meaningful engagement with communities who have traditionally been excluded from decision-making. And it requires addressing the concerns of those who fear being left behind and who are being left behind. This summer, the Biden-Harris administration brought together community leaders, health experts, faith leaders, academics, federal agency representatives, and senior administration officials for the first ever White House Summit on Environmental Justice in Action. This forum builds on that momentum and expanding the conversation to include international perspectives. Let us be clear. Inclusive climate action does not just benefit those who have been marginalized in the past. Inclusive climate action makes for better climate action, including the knowledge, perspective, and experiences of indigenous people, of women, of youth, makes for stronger, more pragmatic, and more resilient investments in our collective future. With that, I want to acknowledge and thank our partners in this work, particularly Maxine Burkett and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, we thank you for your leadership in integrating climate change and justice at the highest policy levels. Thank you to Jaleesa Brooks and the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance team for your support in shaping U.S. humanitarian and development efforts in ways that empowers those who have been historically sidelined. Thank you to the USAID Climate Adaptation Support Activity, or CASA, for the beautiful and delicious lunch. And finally, to our own team here at the Wilson Center, Lauren Reese, Claire Doyle, Angela Soderberg, and the whole Wilson Center family for your efforts in co-organizing this work today. So it is now my pleasure to invite Sonali Corday to the stage for opening remarks. Sonali is the assistant to the administrator of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, where she leads the United States' $12 billion annual investment in disaster risk, recovery, and resilience. Sonali, thank you all.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you so much for those amazing remarks. You're very inspirational. Thank you to the White House and the Wilson Center for bringing us all together for this very important event. I'm delighted to join this important forum to help elevate a core value that drives our work within USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and across the U.S. government, which is centering communities at the heart of our programs to ensure our assistance is inclusive, meets the most immediate needs, and is sensitive to the ways climate change is impacting those we serve. At the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, our mission is clear: to save lives, alleviate suffering, and reduce the impacts of disasters. We monitor, mitigate, and respond to global hazards and humanitarian needs. Climate change has only intensified the demand for our work, as disasters have become more frequent, severe, and complex emergencies are exacerbated by another factor driving vulnerability. However, it's crucial to remember that behind the headlines and the numbers are the people and communities who are often overlooked. Their stories and resilience deserve to be front and center in our work. Throughout my tenure at USAID, I've always believed and experienced myself that communities themselves are the best agent of change. My experiences across the globe, from South Sudan to Colombia, have shown that communities, even those under extreme duress, possess extraordinary strength, knowledge, and capacity to address their own challenges. Our role is not to impose solutions, but to empower, invest, and build partnerships that support them in leading their own recovery and development. So I'll talk about a recent community that I visited back in May, which is in Colombia. So we've seen in Colombia remarkable efforts driven by local communities, particularly women, youth, and Afro-Indigenous populations, to build resilience in the face of both conflict and climate change. I observed these efforts firsthand during a trip to Choco, a vibrant majority Afro-Colombian and Indigenous department on the Colombian Pacific coast. 70% of the population in Choco and other Pacific coast departments now live under the control of non-state armed groups. So conflict continues in Colombia. It's out of the headlines, but it's happening. And humanitarian needs are on the rise as these groups increasingly force communities to displace or endure confinement, which was a new term for me before I got to Colombia. But basically, it refers to movement restrictions that cut off access for entire communities to the outside world for weeks at a time. So they sometimes can't get to crops, they can't get to the neighboring town. It's a really horrific practice. Climatic disasters, including flooding, landslides, drought, and pollution from illegal gold mining, have placed additional strains on these communities across this very remote area. 29 of Choco's 31 municipalities are either under red or orange alert for the effects of La Nina. During my visit, I heard how a recent landslide had caused both of Choco's 2 roads to collapse. Meanwhile, illicit gold mining has saturated the region's largest river and main form of transportation with mercury. depriving many riverside towns of a crucial source of food and water. Now, against this complex backdrop, Choco's Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities are coming together to build a brighter future and leveraging small amounts of our support, but mostly their own local knowledge to create change and recover. So during my visit, we hiked through mud and jungle brush to reach an indigenous community on the road to recovery after a decade of displacement. Small community, 100% community of Baudata, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, had been confined 3 times and displaced 5 times over the past 10 years before settling on safer land, which we hope will stay safe, land that they secured rights to and were starting to cultivate local crops, including traditional methods to grow their own vegetables and feed their families. The community had the foundation to recover and over time, hopefully rebuild local knowledge and just an incredible strength of spirit. Our emergency and early recovery assistance was impactful, but it was really because we were able to center the assistance on what the communities themselves needed. These communities are not passive recipients of aid. They are active agents of change, using their lived experience to drive local solutions. Our work there involves providing technical support to national and local institutions. We met with the governor of Choco, amazing woman. She knew exactly what she needed from us, but she was in charge and just continues to, I think about her often. She's got a huge weight on her shoulders, but is very forceful and dynamic and knew exactly what she needed, and she's going to get there. I have no doubt. But anyway, this is just an example of, again, supporting local institutions and looking at ways, both from the community level to the department level, and how we can support capacity building and resiliency. And again, it is about communities taking care of themselves and becoming self-reliant. By strengthening economic integration, supporting climate adaptation, addressing food security and nutrition challenges, we're doing a small part to Colombia's efforts to promote prosperity across its territories. And it's a prosperity and a future that's defined by the people of Colombia and the communities of Colombia who continue to persevere in spite of all the hardships, of which I just mentioned a few. Our responsibility and our approach needs to be to remove any airs of paternalism from our assistance, to ensure that we're building true partnerships with local actors, those who understand what they need better than anyone else. And by focusing on inclusive and community-led solutions, we're investing in a future where communities have the tools and support to thrive in the face of climate change, conflict, economic stress, food insecurity. List goes on and on. But I'm very happy to be here again and look forward to working with everyone here and a broader community to ensure that our actions really reflect this commitment, which is to empower local communities, amplify their voice, and let them lead. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jolisa Brooks, Deputy Environmental Officer for the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and a proud U.S. Foreign Service officer. When I reflect on my journey into both development and diplomacy, I'm reminded of the stories in the communities that have shaped my approach to this work. Growing up in Detroit, I was acutely aware of the economic disenfranchisement and the environmental degradation that weighed heavily on my hometown. At the time, I believed that the struggles of pollution, environmental injustice, and global warming were unique to Detroit. It wasn't until a much younger Jolisa traveled to Madagascar, Eager to learn more about the beauty of the world, that I realized that the ugliness that plagues underserved communities around the globe, pollution, environmental exploitation, and the legacies of systemic inequity were not just struggles of Detroit, nor were they uniquely American. That experience opened my eyes to a world much bigger than the small radius of my reality, and I came to understand that my responsibility extended beyond my community to a global community. When I think about my approach to equity, inclusion, accountability, particularly in the environmental movement and development broadly, I remember the Black and Indigenous women and men who, while fighting for their basic humanity and human dignity, were also fighting to conserve and protect the places where we live, work, learn, love, and play. The practitioners, academics, and community leaders, some present in this very room, have held their communities together in pursuit of environmental equity. Their legacy drives this work forward. The stories from places like Ahasi, Abanja, and Acostia, Dexter, Linwood, and Schoolcraft, those are the stories and communities that drive me forward. They remind me that no matter how big the challenges or how complex the system, it is community that binds us together and propels us towards inclusive solutions. In that spirit, we turn to this afternoon's panel on Indigenous and community power. It is my pleasure to introduce a leader who has spent over 20 years working not only to alleviate human suffering and combat the climate crisis, from the Department of State to the International Committee of the Red Cross and now USAID, my Deputy Assistant Administrator, Marsha Wong.
I'm supposed to be up here at the big mic, but I know I'm going to be joined by the real experts. But thank you again, Julissa, Bishop, to Sonali for the opening and setting the scene for us. I'm very honored and I'm very actually humbled to welcome you today to today's panel on Indigenous and community power, localizing climate action, unpacking the crucial role of Indigenous people and local communities, IPLC, in informing and leading climate change. I think the best thing about these sessions is that we're going to leave learning something, and I already learned something from my remarks, because did you know that Indigenous people manage over 25% of the world's land surface, which intersects with 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes? It shouldn't come as any surprise then that they possess the deep-rooted knowledge about the environment and offer climate solutions centered around traditional practices that emphasizes local knowledge and the balance between humans and the natural world, an approach that sustained ecosystems for generations. Yet, let me ask you a couple questions. Do we turn to them for that knowledge? Do we turn to them for that power? Despite their environmental leadership, Indigenous peoples and local communities have historically been excluded from global and national climate policymaking, decision-making, action, and resources. So, at USAID, we are working to center Indigenous and local communities in our environmental programming, honoring their traditional practices, advancing their pursuit of sustainable livelihoods, and supporting their leadership in disaster risk reduction, climate mitigation, and adaptation. And these efforts are part of a broader commitment of putting diverse local actors in the lead, strengthening local systems and responding to local communities. In 2020, USAID adopted its Promoting the Rights of Indigenous Peoples policy. The policy ensures that the agency's staff and our implementing partners engage Indigenous peoples as equal partners in the development process. We're channeling more funding directly to local partners with a goal to direct 25% of our development program funds to local partners by the end of fiscal year 2025. Set your clocks. The pressure. But we recognize it's not just giving money and say, do what we think. We have to shift the power. So shifting powers to local actors. So by 2030, at least half of our development programs will include local leadership. This means activities will place Indigenous peoples and local communities in the lead to co-design, set priorities, drive implementation, evaluate that impact. And so through that co-creation process, we aim to implement our locally led agenda and even move beyond the free, prior, and informed consent. That was a mouthful. Free, prior, and informed consent. And when I say this, I mean that we do not just want consent from Indigenous peoples, but rather that equal partnership where we jointly create the goals, programmatic interventions, implement monitoring and learning to ensure that the program can best achieve a respectful impact for these communities themselves. So simply put, it reflects the inclusivity of nothing about us without us. In BHA, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, we have also recently finalized a policy on locally led humanitarian assistance. Please look it up. Please still continue to provide us feedback on it. We do believe and aim to build this, that local leaders are uniquely positioned to respond to crises in ways that doesn't just meet the immediate need, but sets their communities on the pathway for sustained long-term recovery. So I'm honored and humbled to be moderating this important conversation today. We are joined by an incredible panel of leaders, each with a deep expertise in the intersections of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and climate action. So if I may invite my colleagues up onto the stage, Desiree Cormier-Smith, Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice at the Department of State. Thank you, Desiree. Next, all the way in from Ecuador, so thank you, Juan Carlos Hintiac, Executive Secretary of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Lindsay Allen, the Executive Director of the Climate and Land Use Alliance. And Dr. Gerald Torres, Professor of Environmental Justice at Yale School of the Environment and Yale Law School. Thank you all. And we are eager to hear your insights on advancing Indigenous and local community leadership in climate action, as these communities are not only on the front line of climate impacts, but also at the forefront of the solutions. And we'll aim to leave some time for questions from all of you too. Please be provocative. Thank you. No pressure, my panelists. So thank you all. Great. Thank you so much for joining today. We're just going to hop right into the questions now. So Desiree, by pride of being on the left, I am going to start with you. And if you're comfortable with my referring to this community by this acronym, because otherwise it's going to get long with us, but IPLCs are disproportionately affected by climate change, but they continue to show incredible resilience, which we shouldn't take for advantage, but nonetheless. So can you share with us a little bit from your work how you've seen these communities and how they've been impacted, how that resilience contributes to the broader climate solution, and if there's a special illustration you can share with us to make it real?
Yeah, thank you. And let me just first thank your team, and especially Jaleesa, for putting this together and for your great work. And thank you all for having me, and what an honor it is to be on this panel with such distinguished leaders in this field. Let me start by saying I'm not a climate expert per se, but climate is a racial justice issue. Right? As Jaleesa mentioned, it is primarily, disproportionately, Black and Indigenous communities who are on the front lines of climate change, of climate injustice, and who bear the biggest brunt of these challenges, and yet are often left out of the rooms where the decisions are being made about them. This is particularly true for Indigenous peoples around the world, where for far too often they're told, right, what they need to do instead of actually being consulted and given and being put in the driver's seat. When they have the knowledge, they have the answers, they just often are disconnected from the resources, and that is generally intentional and structural, right? So my work at the State Department, I'm the first Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. It's a brand new position that was established in 2022. And my mandate is to try to ensure, I'm very humble about this because it is a new mandate and it's also a very difficult mandate, try to ensure that U.S. foreign policy programs and assistance serves to promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and Indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to build global partnerships to combat structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. To be clear, my mandate was not created because we think we have solved these challenges already in the United States. As my colleague Jaleesa brilliantly said, like a lot of us have come to this work thinking that these challenges were unique to our communities here in the United States. And when she was talking about growing up in Detroit and seeing some of the challenges, I was brought back to my childhood growing up in Inglewood and South Central and wondering why my community didn't have the same kind of resources, was bearing this significant environmental damage in other communities like Beverly Hills or West LA were not, being impacted in the same way. So this is truly a global challenge, which is why my mandate exists, a challenge that is not unique to the United States, and a challenge that the United States is not immune from. So we approach And when I say we, myself and my team, we approach this work with great humility because we know we have a lot of challenges here in the United States. And to say that is an understatement, right? But we also know that the solutions are not going to necessarily come from the United States. So there's an opportunity here for partnership, for us to exchange ideas, exchange lessons learned, exchange best practices with other communities. And that is a two-way street. And it has to be a two-way street because we deal with some of the exact same issues here in the United States. And particularly when it comes to engaging with indigenous peoples around the world, I must give kudos to USAID. You all, I think, are doing this much better in many regards than the State Department. And we have a lot to learn from you all. And when I travel around the world and engage with indigenous peoples, to the extent they have had contact with the U.S. Embassy, which is not always, it is generally through USAID. And so I give you kudos, and I encourage my colleagues who are State Department employees at embassies overseas, if they don't know where to start with the USAID partners. Because again, it's the indigenous peoples, it's the communities of African descent who are on the front lines of not only climate change, but other challenges that the State Department is meant to address, whether that's democratic backsliding, food insecurity, peace insecurity, migration. All of these communities are on the front line, and yet they are often completely ignored or erased when it comes to finding solutions, whether they're policy solutions or programmatic solutions. So my answer to this is to always, when I talk to Foreign Service officers going out to the field and they say, well, how do we do this? I said, easy, go talk to the communities. They know the challenges that they're facing and they also know the answers. They just are often, again, excluded from the rooms where the decisions are being made. And so I will stop there because I want to hear from my brilliant panelists, but I could go on, if you can't tell, for a long time about this work because it is frontier work for the State Department, and it is very important work, and it's exciting. We still have a long way to go, but we're in the initial stages, and I think what we're doing now is really building a foundation, hopefully, for work, improved work on this front in terms of partnership with indigenous peoples and other communities who have been marginalized for years to come.
Desiree, thank you so much. And all those nice words about USAID, I did not plant those. I did not. But I think it's a recognition. It's a whole of government, if I can use that terminology. But I would like to take from the big macro down to Juan Carlos. And thank you, Juan, again, Juan Carlos, for joining us from Ecuador. You are a leader. You are working with other leaders around the world from indigenous communities. And could you tell us if you feel there are indeed places to exchange these lessons that Desiree described? Are we helping? How can we help elevate and amplify concerns and solutions better? And if you would, and please be blunt with us, what are those barriers that communities face in scaling up these initiatives? Or are you being heard?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the organizers and for the invitation. On behalf of the indigenous leaders, network the Global Alliance, what is indigenous organizations with a long background history from Indonesia, Amman, in Asia, Congo Basin, the 8 countries in Africa, Congo Basin, Repaliak, Amazon Basin, where I am from, one of the indigenous group, Shuar people from Ecuador, a PB organization in all Brazil, and Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. On behalf and respect of the leaders and the elders and millions of people, thanks again for the invitation. I would like to bring some points and opinions here. First at all, will be a lot of time. I don't have too much time to go into deeper details, but the Global Alliance, the coalition, this amazing coalition to work in solidarity, not only indigenous people around the tropics in the 24 countries that we overlap and connected, but also we have a special relations and with other 7 regions, socioculturals in the planet and the world. Other ecosystems, we cannot leave them in behind. So in that point, from the tropical areas, indigenous people from the Global Alliance, we are following 5 demands very deeply. We are talking about our protocols that free, prior, informed consent, human rights, indigenous people rights, or protocols, how we consult on ourselves, and how we are going to play it in the table with discussion with multi-actors, governments, etc. Second one is about these big announcements and pledges and promises we've been talking with COPs and different momentums in international arenas. And we have proposals. Believe me, we have proposals on the ground. We are defending there as a guardian. And what's the cost about that for us? We're giving our life daily by daily. So to analyze that part, and we're talking about the pledge, and we were welcome to 1.7 million, and it was announced at COP26. But how much percentage from that 1.7 billion was direct on the ground? I think so, 2.1. Who is giving more? We need to realize, to analyze that. We're still there giving our lives. That's the cost. Lives for the planet and also for the Mother Earth. Criminalization, that's the context. And then also with the knowledge. With centuries, I'm telling you, many of my brothers and sisters on the planet, not only the tropics, we have the knowledge, beautiful, ancient knowledge, and the front line that we are protecting. We are part of the nature. We are connected. We are one. We cannot be separated. Water, tree, everything is connected with us. In my own culture, I am part. I'm very well connected. So that's how we interpret the cultural, socio-cultural dynamic with the tree. The voices, the spiritual, we talk with the forest. We have everything in the forest. I think so the numbers 5 that I don't want to invisibilize is that the barriers on the ground is that the threats that some governments or some actors, multilaterals, sometimes they are invisibilized as they don't invite us, or we don't have enabled conditions. I mean, we are not in the conditions to sit down in the same table with huge information. Sometimes there are lack information. Even by some indigenous leaders, they don't speak the Spanish or Portuguese, or they have their own mother language that we have. So this is considerations, the invisibilization. But when we arrive in the table, I always say, let's respect us. I respect you. Let's try to resolve this because we are giving the life and the cost on the ground. And I can keep going, but finally, in this point, we developed as a GATC, a Global Alliance from the Tropics, Shandia initiative. Shandia is a high-level platform, solidarity, to bring transparency about the pledge of the months, what is offered on behalf of indigenous people, on behalf also for the biodiversity or the climate change per se. So we invited all the different other leads and all promises that we need to talk between us and how we make action on the ground urgently, because emergency is there. As fire is there, Mother Earth, we're killing the water and everything. So we are destroying ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. That's both vivid and extremely poignant. But thank you for that powerful voice. Perhaps with you, Lindsay, now, it's a little bit of the other side of the coin in the sense that you're working to pull in the local knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge and cultural practices into climate strategies. Can you describe a little bit of your work? And also, together, how do we overcome that lack of visibility, lack of hearing, and it translates into lack of power? Please.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak on this topic. I think it's still underappreciated as a critical climate solution. And what I would say first is just to explain, so I work with an alliance of donors that are committed to protecting tropical forests in particular because of the biodiversity outcomes, the climate outcomes, and the human rights and indigenous rights outcomes. And one of the things that we see is that it is becoming easier to engage climate donors in understanding first and foremost that tropical forests are a critical part of the climate solution. So either tropical forests will continue to be considered by a very colonial mindset of a place that is devoid of humans, where expansion can come in and extraction is possible, and it's to extract wealth for very few, or it can be seen as a solution that has been stewarded for generations by Indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local communities. So I think the positive sign is it's getting easier to explain that connection. Once we understand that forests are a critical part of the solution, then the question is, who has been advancing that solution? And what we know is where we see tropical forests that are still standing, we see communities that, again, have been ensuring the protection of those forests with their lives for generations. And so I just came from the Brazilian Amazon, and one of the things that one of our partners was saying is, this is not a place that's been devoid of people. We should think about the Amazon basin as one of the greatest technological achievements of Indigenous peoples, because they have lived in relationship with forests. They have cultivated food security, they have maintained clean water, they have maintained local livelihoods for generations, and essentially what is needed is to reduce the amount of threats on their ability to do that stewardship and engage them in the solutions, the newer kind of top-down climate solutions, so that not only are we seeing some of the negative impacts reduced, but we're allowing for the positive aspects to continue. So I think two specific examples. The first builds on what Juan Carlos was mentioning related to the Shandia vision, and this vision from Indigenous communities. So we are a big advocate, and we're actively supporting and encouraging other donors to support direct investments into the Indigenous and Afro-descendant-led territorial funds, right? Because we understand that there's a risk of philanthropy continuing to hold too much power in what decisions are being made. And so this is the parallel to the kind of government risk of directing what needs to happen. There's that risk for philanthropy as well. So there are now territorial funds in a number of these territories that are controlled. They were founded, they are controlled, and they are accountable to the existing governance structures of Indigenous or local or Afro-descendant communities. And they are ready to receive and now positioned to receive resources. So this removes the barrier of those who are saying it's really hard to get money to the local level, or I don't have that expertise to know how to make the right investments. So one is the funds are there, they're ready to receive support. And it's all under this umbrella of the Shandia vision is a big part of that. Two, that when we talk about tropical forests and we talk about the people who are there, there are already many solutions that are mapped in terms of management plans that are called life maps or life plans. So it thinks about what does development look like from the perspective of the community. And so there's that opportunity for, again, us to directly invest in the existing management practices, particularly as we continue to increase resources that need to go for demarcating and recognizing Indigenous rights and territories. So those are two examples I would start with.
Lindsay, thank you. I think that's a really great transition now to Dr. Torres, the lawyer on the panel right now. We're talking a little bit about governance. We're talking about, if I may, a do no harm principle nonetheless. We're talking about exploitation of natural resources, if you want to look at it from a business point of view, but what are the protections and rights that have to be afforded in that? So I was wondering if you could help us a little bit understand what happens when traditional knowledge, nature-based solutions, looking at these ecological initiatives, when they become commodities. What are the protections that should be wrapped around those? And also that those who own that knowledge have lived in these communities on this land. They're also compensated in a way that's respectful and appropriate. So I would love your observations on that.
Well, I'm glad it was an easy question. The question of first of all, respecting indigenous knowledge, right? And then recognizing that it doesn't necessarily fit into the commodity form that knowledge has, unfortunately, the kind of structure it's taken. But I'm glad to meet Juan Carlos because I work with David Cordero Heredia, who's in Ecuador, who works with the various native groups as they attempt to implement the free and prior informed consent and make it a reality. But preserving and protecting indigenous knowledge, I mean, the critical thing is, one, to recognize what it is, right? And to recognize that the people who bring you that knowledge have long been the possessors of it, and that it's not something that is commodifiable as such, but needs to be integrated into the way we think about the problems that we address. Let me give you one example. So this last year, we offered a joint course between Salish Kootenai College and the Yale School of the Environment. And we had forestry grad students from Salish Kootenai and forestry grad students from Yale. And we tried to address the question, the topic was indigenous knowledge and forest management. And so we took that as a serious topic and tried to engage it in a number of ways and to integrate the knowledge that the various different tribal groups brought to the table. That's one. But the thing about it that was interesting to me is it was a 2-hour course. The first hour was a webinar. And we had 3,700 people sign up every week to attend the webinar portion. So the interest in integrating indigenous knowledge and resource management, I think, is critical. The important thing, though, is to think about where you can access that knowledge respectfully across the various resources, however you characterize them, and create a space where that knowledge can be both respected the way in which kind of conventional Western scientific knowledge is respected. First of all, as adding an important and real and concrete additional insight and analytic technique, and to protect the possessors of it. Let me give you one other example, which is slightly off topic, but not completely off topic. And that is, at the University of Texas, when I was there, we created the Center for the Study and Preservation of Indigenous Languages. And one of the things we wanted to do, though, we wanted to make it easier for people to research indigenous languages, but we also wanted to protect the content of the language that and I apologize if I offend anyone, right? But as I said in a meeting, I said the last thing I want to do is wake up one morning and hear some group sampling some of these prayers in some music on an LA radio station, right? And so what we want to do is we want to create clear protocols to protect the knowledge, however it is assembled and made available, at the same time recognizing that the epistemology that is back of that knowledge is complementary to the things that we think of as, kind of solid scientific knowledge. So that's one. The other thing is we need to ask questions about whether the data that we're assembling, right, is in fact the right data. And how has the data that we've been relying on actually created blindnesses as well as illuminated? And let me give you another example. Right. If you were to take a city, let's say New Haven, right, and to ask how many bird species are there in New Haven and where are they located? Well, it turns out that there are far more bird species in the more prosperous parts of New Haven than in the non-prosperous. Now, you could say, well, why is that true? Is it even true? And of course, it's not true. What is true is the data, since birds are mainly, the reporting comes from people who bird watch, right? It's clear that the data that we're getting is skewed, and it's skewed economically. And that's just one example of the way in which data is likely to be skewed. And indigenous knowledge, which is a source of information and data, is likewise also skewed. So I didn't answer your question directly, but the first thing I wanted to note is that you have to recognize that it is knowledge. It's not anything occult. It's not anything that is, outre, right? It's knowledge about the world that we need to integrate into our ways of understanding the world.
Great, thank you. And I think it was very important for Dr. Torres to remind us always of bias. A bias, what do we carry to this? So thank you for that. Protocols, and the importance of data, who's collecting it, who's analyzing it, and then who's using it. All along the way, we have to have these sort of stress tests and sound checks. I'm going to now put you, Desiree, a little bit on the spot, representing the Department of State, which is foreign policy, decision-making, national security agency. When you've heard this rich conversation already, and you're thinking, how am I going to bring what I'm hearing back into this organization? And also, I think importantly, to make it real, not theater, not token. And I know we do risk that at times, that we had checked the box. So please, can you give me a sense of what you're hearing today and where you've been? How do you make sure it's real?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying a couple things. One, I think it's actually the perfect segue when we're talking about bias, right? I mean, let's name that. The State Department is notoriously an institution that is male, pale, and Yale. And not this kind of Yale, right? This is a great Yale. I want to take your class. But,
It just rhymes.
it just rhymes.
I can leave now.
But that is to say, it's an institution that was not necessarily not built for Black, brown people, right? Not built for women, not built for LGBTQI plus folks, not built for people with disabilities, and so we have to acknowledge that, because the fact that the State Department is now intentionally trying to become a better reflection of the American people and all of our diversity it's a new effort. So it's going to take us a while to get there. So it is important to acknowledge that bias that is present in data collection and academia is also present in our foreign policy, I think in ways that are quite obvious and then ways that are not so obvious. And that should not be a controversial statement, right? This is, I think, true for most of our institutions, and the State Department does not have an immunity to that. And so that is a very real challenge when we talk about racial justice work. Again, and I apologize if I sound like a broken record, but it's important to remind folks that my mandate is new. And the State Department is a notoriously hierarchical, bureaucratic, old school institution that can often be immune to anything new. And while I feel very strongly that my work to amplify and acknowledge and recognize the dignity and humanity and basic human rights of Indigenous peoples, of Black people, of Roma people, and of other people who are marginalized simply because of their race, ethnicity, caste, that should not be a controversial thing to do. But unfortunately, to some people it is. And so that is a very real obstacle that I face and that my team faces daily. And while we are committed to this work and we do our best to train as many Foreign Service officers going out into the field, as well as civil servants and other State Department employees here in Washington on how to do this work appropriately, not in a tokenizing kind of way, but also in a sustainable way, which again, therefore it must start by engaging the communities themselves and listening to them. We're not going to get it perfect. I'm just going to be real here. There's no way that every single employee of the State Department is going to do this exactly right as we would like to see it. And that is an unfortunate reality. But we are trying our best to equip everyone, to give them the knowledge, the tools, the resources, and frankly, the confidence, because it's also quite disheartening to hear folks say, well, I don't feel comfortable talking about this. Must be nice to have that kind of discomfort instead of actually being on the receiving end of racism or discrimination or xenophobia, right? So it's helping our colleagues understand how to do this in a meaningful way, how to do this in a sustainable way, and how to do this in a way that has the most impact. And we always emphasize that is done by starting by listening to the communities themselves and following their lead and then constantly engaging with them. So then I always get the question of how do we do monitoring and evaluation? Easy, go talk to the communities. See if they've felt the impact. See if they've noticed a difference. If they haven't, go back to the drawing board with them and revise the approach. But again, this is a new way of thinking for the State Department, and so we are just at the precipice of this. We're just starting it, and unfortunately, we're up against again a slow-moving bureaucracy versus the fierce urgency of now. So it can be quite frustrating, but that frustration pales in terms of the real pain that communities are facing. So.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you for that reminder of some of my best work at State Department was when I was most uncomfortable, because pressure has its influence. Juan Carlos, you've been such a good sport, to be honest. We're here trying to figure out how to make the U.S. government interagency bureaucracy work. Anybody? But what we do need to hear from you, and I hope it will be optimistic and heartening, but be candid with us. Local governance structures in these communities, the Shandia Initiative, in the Global Alliance, what is happening with local governance that you can say, you in Washington, you can sit there with your administrative guidance and this and that, but we're doing it because local governance is allowing us, or we are making local governance work for us. Can you give us some examples of that, where it works and maybe where it didn't?
Thank you. When I am speaking here, Executive Secretary of JFTC, I have to bring in the context that in the memorial time that we are oral transition and knowledge with the elders to the youth, we have to imagine different momentums. For example, in my own group, the Shuar people, we wake up in the morning and we listen to the elder, and we plan the day, we plan the week, or how was. We work with the dreams and for the elder dreams, and we are connected with the Mother Earth, where we are walking, hunting, eating. In that context, I think so we need to recognize that governments, they did a lot of effort to listen to us, but the leaders, elders, they were walking to the world to bring our concerns from the ground, how we will invisibilize it, we were criminalized, etc., etc. But we have law, United Nations Indigenous People Rights, we have other treaties. Sometimes some governments, they like to speak very beautiful in the international context, but when they are going back in the home, they don't want to even receive you in the office. We don't know the minister sometimes. I have many stories about it, very sad stories. And we have to do all our effort to bring our points from the ground, what is going on. So, but has to change this dynamics because we are very well organized ourselves. We are working together in unity. We are learning experience between us and Amazon Basin and the tropical areas organizations because we need to recognize our own governance. The elders, how they communicate in the communities, and how that we elect leaders. We not just elect leaders from the door, you are indigenous leaders, you are shaman. No, we have protocols. We know who is the shaman, who is the leader. We have to be very careful who is talking on behalf of us, making deals on behalf of us. We have to be very transparent. And many of the donors or something make that mistake. They listen to the wrong people with a lot of respect. But also, when we receive people on the ground, our governance or structures are very well considered. We have problems like everybody. We have problems. We have issues. We have items to discuss. We have the challenge on the ground. But this cultural diversity that we, as indigenous people, connected with our beautiful ecosystems that we are living in the oceans and the mountains and the tropics, and the science recognize that in text, and the leaders who make the decisions in the context and the climate change COPs or biodiversity COPs, they've been reading there. They speak very beautiful, but they need to connect with the public politics action. I need to reflect that because many of the rivers are contaminated with the big concessions sometimes. Some governments know about that. No, it's not just only China or maybe Canada or everything, but we need to work in solidarity. The information has to be transparent, how the leaders, they need to make decisions, the equal conditions, because what is going to be benefit for education, healthcare, but with our own vision. Because in the way that we are walking right now, it's unsustainable. And the elders were saying that we have this vision, we work with that vision, and we work with that message, indigenous people. So to connect that, there's a beautiful examples on the ground with knowledge, with vision. We talk, we hold, we manage the land, we eat from the land, and the mothers and the elders, they sing, they touch it, and then we are living in that context that we have something to inspire, to contribute to the world. So we need to change this dynamic. The consuming, so it's in your hands, it's in your systemic. But we know that some countries we are going to the COP29. I was here in the morning that Dr. John Podesta and the beautiful panel was there. I was thinking, we are going to the COP with this COP29, with the oil. Okay, indigenous people, we don't want to use any more oil from the ground and the mining, but we did a referendum. Who is respecting that referendum in my country? We have indigenous people rights, collective rights. It's in the constitutions. We have the model in the constitutions. So examples, for example, in Peru, brothers and sisters from Camaracayre, we are working, a group of Peru with government. All the indigenous groups, different, they don't work, they don't dig together, but they have a proposal. I was sharing with my friend here, Lindsay, that many years ago, how to connect carbon markets in the indigenous territory or the indigenous leaders. How you translate that carbon markets in my own language and the other language group. Biodiversity credit. How you translate that? NDC and many other credits. Wait a second. I mean, give me the chance. Not just for the picture. Not just to be in the PhD paper and in wherever university, and this is an Indian speaking. No, you were here, listen to me, transform my knowledge, and put in this benefit together, equal conditions. Yeah. So let's change the dynamic. I will keep going, but finally, and that contextualize, we have governance. We are indigenous leaders elected within governance with own decisions that in assembly. So that protocols makes us to tell us how we are going to do with plans of life. I think so. This is something that we need to reinforce and connect with governments like USA or power governments have to bring in the table. I mean, the self-determination for some indigenous group to say yes or no, but we need to free pre-informed consent. You need to ask me how you are going to kill me or how you are going to help me. That's good for my kids, for generations. How I want to contribute. I give in my life. I give in contribution to the life. So this we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is sobering hard work. So thank you for reminding us of that. Lindsay, again, this is almost a perfect sort of pairing here of your work also to pull this in and to help change the dynamic. You're speaking to a room of people here in DC who, to all various degrees, have that ability to change the dynamic. What have you seen that works and what we can truly champion?
Yeah. So I answer with a lot of humility, right? Because I don't think we have fully realized the potential of what could work. But there are some examples. So as I mentioned, the parallel to having a top-down approach to foreign aid is having a top-down approach coming from the philanthropic sector. And one of the things that we saw in the climate negotiations that happened in Glasgow was a declaration by 145 countries that were committed to halting and reversing forest loss. That was really significant. And it raised the question of, okay, how does that happen? How does that happen when the amounts of money that each of those governments have are very different in terms of being able to implement that policy? So one of the things that we helped to organize was to get together with a group of donors and say philanthropy is showing up to really, in particular, reinforce the commitment that's being made by developing countries and by tropical forest countries in particular. So we hoped to create a forest people climate collaborative that wasn't just in relationship with government negotiations and a commitment, and it wasn't just with philanthropic institutions, but it was also with civil society partners. And the goal was one of the goals was to really correct the imbalance in whether or not resources get to the local level. Because what we see both with development aid is paralleled in what we see with philanthropic support, and it is that resources that come primarily from northern countries stay in the north. And when that happens, you really risk any ability to have long-term capacity building for civil society institutions. It risks the resilience of our strategies over time. So you might be able to do something that's good for a very small amount of time, but you can't maintain it. You can't maintain it unless it's led at the local level, unless it has support at the local level, unless there are benefits at the local level. So one of the other elements of this collaborative is to have bottom-up strategies instead of top-down strategies. We're not giving up on having a global impact. We want to have a global impact. That's part of the Glasgow commitment. But the way that we do it and the way that we shift power and share power in doing that is really important. So of the 9 strategies that were created, we helped to fund the infrastructure so that those strategies could be built by civil society partners at the local level, and they could decide when to pull in additional expertise from outside of the geographies. And then the role as donors, and it's a good accountability mechanism for us, is to show up in alignment with those priorities as they're determined. And so it's still early on. We're only in the 2nd year of the collaborative, but I think it's a good indicator of what's possible if we really think about shifting power and shifting resources.
Lindsay, thank you for that. Again, having a sense of the concreteness of how to change that dynamic, it's useful to hear these. And again, to think responsibility to all of those with .gov in your job title, how do we take what we're hearing today and doing that? I'm going to give the last question, and then hopefully we'll have room for 1 or 2 from the audience. But to you, Dr. Torres. Okay, I'm putting you on the spot here now. This is a room of .gov. There are a lot of people here from the U.S. government, but also leading NGOs, think tanks, other influencers, enablers, facilitators, or just individual voices. That's a lot to put in front of you, but here I go. If you had one thing you would like us to consider to change the dynamic, where would you start? I'm so mean to you.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave me those softball questions.
Just benefit from all this knowledge. It comes
Well,
from
I mean, the one principle that's been articulated across the panelists is that you've got to listen to the voices from the bottom.
Yeah.
Right. And so back when I was asked to do the first draft of the Executive Order on Environmental Justice in the Clinton administration, what I did was to invite environmental justice groups from around the country to come into the Department of Justice and talk to me. Yeah, and 2 things happened. One is the definition of what counted as an environmental issue was far broader than what me with my techno, environmental lawyer head conceived of. So then you have to think, okay, how do I draft a document that captures the knowledge that I'm gathering from these community groups? And then you ask, because you can't do it all in one document, is how do I try to design projects or programs that speak to the issues that I've heard come up, right? So it's taking it very, very seriously. But back during that same period, I had a long, almost 3-hour conversation with the State Department over whether the policy they were about to announce was for the self-determination of people or peoples. Right? And so we argued about that S for a long time.
Yes.
Right.
The lawyers were in the room.
Right. So I guess if I could, one thing is to take seriously the knowledge that people have accumulated from their lived experience, right, and factor that into the way in which you assemble all the other pieces of data that are essential for producing the program, the policy, the research questions that you're going to examine, and don't check your own kind of hierarchy of value as you examine these questions. I guess that's what I would say. So that I didn't really answer your question.
No, actually, you did. Actually, you did. No, thank you. I've been helped by a very wonderful colleague who's reminding me of time, and I had promised that we would try to fit in at least one question, maybe. So could I have, yes, please state your name and your affiliation. I'm looking at you, but please let it be a question. And we can, I've been told I've got 4 minutes. I've got 4 minutes, so let's go.
Thank you. Thank you all for your perspectives, and thank you to Jolisa for the fabulous event. My name is Lanita Johnson. I'm a Foreign Service Officer with USAID, but I'm also a small business owner focusing on youth, positive youth development in a lot of these spaces. And I've been really excited to hear about the inclusive development from indigenous populations and the art of being provocative. I also challenge the use of bottom up and say local up. And my question for y'all in your respective works, how are you engaging youth? Because they're not at the table today, right? And so when we talk about youth, we're often hearing it in the form of labor, workforce development, which it is, but they're inheriting these issues, and the statistics show that they're just as concerned, but they don't feel that they have agency in this. So how are y'all implementing a local up and youth-led approach to climate action?
Okay. I'm bouncing in my chair because I'm going to take the mic just for 5 seconds. Then, and we're going to do lightning round on youth. But if I may, BHA, we're promoting the Melanesian Youth Corps across 4 Pacific Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Solomon. And it is youth leadership, because exactly what you said. Don't look at me as a person who's going to come into your factory. Look at me as a person who wants to create conditions for all to benefit from this, including youth. So thank you. But lightning round on how are we talking to the young people? And I'm kind of, but anyway, no youth on this panel? Please, Desiree.
Just as I had to explain to someone today who I had a meeting with, I look younger than I am, so I know that I'm no longer considered a youth, but it is very important to me that we intentionally engage youth. And I'm actually really glad you asked this question. I was looking around to see if my team, someone encouraged you to ask this question, because one of the things I was supposed to mention and I didn't is that last year my team intentionally created a cohort called the Indigenous Youth Leadership Coalition. And that was with this specific intent to bring global young Indigenous leaders to Washington to participate in the White House Tribal Youth Forum on the margins of the White House Tribal Nation Summit. This came out of a dream, out of a conversation with colleagues from the Department of the Interior as we were talking about preparations for the White House Tribal Nation Summit. I was asking how young people are engaged. And they said, oh, there's now a youth summit. And I said, great. Do we normally invite international young people to that? And they said no. And I said, well, why not? Because they're facing a lot of the same challenges that our Native American young people are facing, whether it's climate change, the loss of indigenous language, any health, education, et cetera, violence, police violence, right? And so with a very small grant, my team was able to start this program, and we brought in 6 phenomenal young leaders from the Western Hemisphere because the grant was so small. We are now trying to find additional resources, maybe USAID can help us, to expand that program, because there are indigenous leaders in Australia and New Zealand and across Asia that we also want to bring. And we know that that is expensive. And we also have to ensure that we are not limiting these kinds of opportunities to indigenous youth who only speak English, because that's not fair, right? And that's only going to get us a certain class of folks, and not necessarily local up. So these are very intentional conversations that my team are driving at the State Department with very limited resources. And when I say limited resources, my team doesn't have a budget. So the fact that we were able to create this program, I think is just a testament to the resiliency and the persistence of my team. But we are very intentional about bringing young people into the conversation. One last thing on the IYLC, because it's also very important, because we don't believe in just token sort of one-off opportunities where you bring them to Washington for a quick photo op and we could say, look what we did. We have worked in partnership with Unity, a Native American organization, and the Skull Foundation to continue to engage those same 6 young leaders through virtual workshops and then bringing them back next year to Washington, D.C., but also, I believe, to a tribal nation in Arizona, somewhere on the West Coast. And we do this with the intention of engaging them so that they can build coalitions across themselves, but also with U.S. government officials. We brought some of them to New York to engage directly with U.S. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland on issues of climate change on the margins of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where we also allow them to attend. So we're very intentional about this because even though I'm no longer a youth, I'm kind of slightly just removed. So it is very important.
How define youth? Lightning round. Juan Carlos. Youth.
Sorry.
Define youth.
No, thank you very much for your question. I was thinking what I was going to answer to, just joking. And I would like to invite you to know us. We can talk more in details later, but the structure of indigenous governance, we have also our youth representative, also women representative. As a global alliance coming from the ground, we listen to our own governance, our own leaders, and who is going to be the voice of the global alliance. We have a youth representing the global alliance. This is one brother from Brazil. And also women, equity and justice and everything. We have a global movement under the JTC women. But my petition is that you have to help us to connect, because most of the youth leaders, they don't speak English or French. This language from the United Nations per se, right? Mm-hmm. But between us, when I was recently visiting some organization sister in Brazil, I saw a lot of youth there. Even some mothers handed the babies. I mean, this is going to be a leader. I mean, it has the spirit connection. They don't have to speak, it's the feeling connection. So it's very important. Finally, if you permit me, I just want to very consensus that we are thinking that people, we cannot leave nobody behind, so I want to bring my voices from some solidarity for indigenous people who are not contacted. They are on transition. Some people in contact, they are suffering a lot for the fires and everything with the illegal logging and mining in the deeper forests. So this is a petition, so governments, Department of States and other governments, but this is some people, even though have the chance to survive sometimes, this is under a lot of threats. I just want to bring that, people who are not contacted. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I'll give one example of a fund. There is now, it's a couple years old, the Youth Climate Justice Fund, which its entire goal is engage youth leaders. It was founded by youth leaders. It funds youth leaders. It's a participatory grant-making process, and it's getting resources to the grassroots level. And just as many of the funds that were initiated by those without endowments behind them, they do find it challenging to break through to the level of scale that is possible. So they receive far more requests and initiatives and ideas from all around the world than they have resources to fund. So
I completely agree with you that incorporating youth voices is essential. We don't do it systematically except around our annual Global Environmental Justice Conference, where we work with New Haven high schools. And we work with them throughout the year, but the hard work comes basically at the conference. We also have a youth track at the conference so that we integrate youth voices in the conference, and we put them in contact then with people from global activists and scholars. So it's that's one way we've done it. It's not enough. I concede. But you need to have it at least as a thought going forward as you organize the work that you do, because, I mean, they're here, going to be here. It's their world.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the panelists for this really thoughtful and provocative conversation. I hope all of you who joined us today, I need you to take this conversation, I need you to turn it into action. Let me now turn the mic over to the Wilson Center's Lauren Reese to introduce the next panel on financing inclusive climate action. You can draw some of those finances our way. Thank you all. That's all it is.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So nice to meet you.
So do you have a
Thank you.
I have one, yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to acknowledge that we have asked you to sit through a marathon session here this afternoon, so if you need to stand up, I'm going to ask you not to start any conversations because we do not have time to finish those conversations right now, but if you want to stand up and stretch your legs, if you need to use the facilities, please, now is the time to do that. And I will try to talk slow and give you some more time to get back before our next panel. Thank you, Marcia, and for that panel. I think, we started with a pretty high bar, and it has only grown. So panel 2, get ready. That was a really fantastic discussion, and really appreciate sort of the breadth and the depth of the topics. Lanita, I think she disappeared. I think that your point about the bottom up, I had the same, for some reason that hit me wrong this morning, and I was trying to think of it as core out. Like I was trying to think, like we need to maybe sort of rethink how we talk about community engagement. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take a quick minute to introduce our next panel. I was drawn to the Wilson Center because of the work that ECSP does to ensure that foreign policy and international development are responsive to the realities of that people are facing on a daily basis. But my interest in this area was actually sparked by the experience I had as a volunteer in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. Going door to door in that city taught me 3 key things, each which I think has been very much reflected in today's forum. First, a community's resilience can be reinforced by external forces, but it is born from within. Second, environmental factors, including extreme weather events, can be a significant driver of insecurity. And third, inequity is often embedded in the very landscape on which homes are built. So it only took a short time after I joined the Wilson Center to recognize an additional piece of the puzzle, which is financing. The best laid plans get you nowhere if the mechanisms to finance those plans are not structured in a way that is accessible to those most affected by climate change. I think it came out in the last panel that even some of the language, right, the barriers of language, I find that in my own work here, the barriers of my understanding of what some of the climate finance language is, right? And so being able to bring that knowledge to bear across sectors. So our last panel of the day is going to delve into this topic with a focus on financing inclusive climate action. I'd like to invite our panel to take the floor while I introduce our moderator, Jake Levine, who is uniquely suited to lead this discussion. Jake is Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the National Security Council. He previously served, however, as the first Chief Climate Officer at the Development Finance Corporation. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Stellar panel in a moment. And Lauren, thanks so much for hosting and pulling this event together. Thank you to everybody who's been here. I know many of you came over from the White House and have had a full day. And I know there are a lot of people following online. So when I learned about this event, in fact, I was still over at DFC. I just was so beside myself excited because of the importance of this issue and the hard work that so many people have done to bring it to the fore. I'm really thrilled and humbled to get to be a part of it. Let me first just thank Maxine Burkett, who I see sitting in the second row, who really has been the driving force on this and the spirit behind so much of this work for many, many years, including many, many years before her time in the administration. I got to know Maxine first as a law professor at the University of Hawaii, which maybe will be a future incarnation, a reincarnation of Maxine again. And I want to say thanks for your leadership, Maxine. It's really, really critical. There are a couple other people I want to thank. I want to thank Swati Viravalli, who has been leading this work at the NSC very ably and capably for the last few years. I see Aparna Srivastav in the audience, who's carrying forward the finance vision on this at DFC. There's too many people, but I did want to call out those leaders. This work is often happening behind the scenes, and there's a lot of it, and it's worth recognizing their leadership. So let's get started. As Lauren mentioned, I serve as Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the NSC at the White House. I'm really excited to be a part of this session on climate finance, community ownership, decision-making, inclusivity, transparency, accountability, the intersection of all of that. I do want to say, just on a personal note, I sort of got my start in the climate world in the environmental justice space. So I'm really excited to see this issue come to the fore here. My start on this was in California, working for my state senator, a woman named Fran Pavley, who was a climate leader who I think became somewhat of an unsung climate justice and climate equity leader. We had the chance to work together on legislation there with another assembly member named Eduardo Garcia on a bill called AB 17, which made sure that as the state was in sort of moving its nationally leading climate policy forward, that it was doing so with certain principles of climate justice and equity in mind. And a lot of that work, particularly in the days of what was known as the SB 535 coalition, which I'm sure many of you were part of, that work has made its way into the Biden-Harris agenda in the form of Justice 40 in particular, but in a whole host of other policies. And the story of that agenda that this administration has taken forward is actually really simple, and I think it makes sense, and it bears some very brief repeating, which is to say that when the president took office and was staring down multiple crises, he and the vice president determined that the engine of economic growth and opportunity in terms of job creation and prosperity for the next generation would come in the form of the clean energy transition through which we're now living. And I think that has started to bear fruit. You see $900 billion of investment across the United States in manufacturing, more than 500 new clean energy facilities that have taken root and taken life, more than 300,000 new jobs in clean energy, which is a sector of the job market that is growing at 2x the rate of the national labor market. But the thing that this administration did that I think was different from the old playbook was that it recognized something critical about this thesis for growth, which is that you can't have a clean energy transition without making it a just transition. You can't generate new investment without ensuring that those investments are made equitably and in the places that need them most. And that is what ultimately informed Justice 40, taking something that had California roots, New York roots, making it into a national policy to direct that 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments in climate and clean energy would accrue to disadvantaged communities. That spirit is what has informed certain parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, building on Justice 40 by establishing grant programs designed to support community-led projects. For example, $2 billion at EPA's Environmental and Climate Justice Program to build community capacity and address environmental and climate challenges at the local level. It's what informed something like the Energy Community Bonus in the IRA, adding 10% of value onto the production tax credit for projects that are sited in communities that had previously been energy communities. It's what informed Solar for All, a program working with marginalized and low-income households to benefit from solar energy. And it's why initiatives like the Women in Sustainable Economy program, also known as WISE, a public-private partnership which was launched by Vice President Harris in 2023 to expand women's access to employment, training, leadership roles, and financial resources could come to life. And it's why I think we're all gathered here today that in the international context, we've been focused on initiatives like Prepare, for which we've secured $2.3 billion of USG resources in FY22. We've mobilized the private sector. I think you heard a little bit from John Podesta this morning about the work that we've done so far to bring 39 companies into the call to action, mobilizing over $3 billion in adaptation and resilience resources and investing in resilience in 42 countries. That is the type of work that enables us to start looking at the scale of the challenge with serious and meaningful tools to address that enormous workload in front of us. Because if you consider that we remain somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion shy of what we need to help emerging economies get on a track to a climate resilient future, and you consider the enormous management challenge that represents in terms of allocating that funding to the people and the communities that need it the most, you recognize that even though we've done great work so far, we have an enormous way to go. So that is why I'm really excited to dive into this panel to take on questions around how can we make sure our commercial finance, our MDBs, DFIs, public finance institutions are infusing these principles of what it means to be doing justice and equity in the climate space into the work that they're doing to invest, to finance, to provide technical assistance. How do we confront the reality that just because, for example, we're doing work in developing economies, we may not necessarily be supporting the most vulnerable or the hardest hit communities? These are really hard questions, and we have such an excellent group of people, leaders here who are working on answering those questions. So let me introduce, I'll try to go starting with my neighbor, Dilafruz, and I'm going to try on the first try, Dilafruz Konnikboyeva-ish?
We'll give it to you.
Tell us how to...
Dilafruz Konnikboyeva.
Okay, Dilafruz Konnikboyeva, inaugural executive director of the Home Planet Fund. Thank you for joining us. My colleague, Jacqueline Mutsitwa, deputy assistant administrator for USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, also climate finance alum. Bella Tonkanagi, senior advisor at the Climate Hub, this is outdated, CPI.
Climate Hub Treasury, yep. Before CPI, yes.
Thank you. And Laura Garcia, president and CEO of Global Green Grants Fund. So throughout the conversation today, I encourage you to consider how we can collectively work towards creating a more inclusive framework for climate finance, one that not only addresses environmental concerns, but also lifts up communities and fosters resilience. I look forward to our discussion, and I think I'll just start with a general question for the group, and maybe Dilafruz, we can start with you. How do you, when we talk about sort of access and breaking down barriers to dispersing and accessing finance, how do you think about reducing those barriers for local organizations and communities to access what is oftentimes delivered in more traditional channels and conventional methods?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And I also want to echo the thanks for Maxine and then Jolisa Brooks, too. Thank you for having all of us and putting this together. For us, that's actually the question why and how we got to the Home Planet Fund. So a little bit over 2 years ago, a couple of us were just thinking, how we know the crisis is upon us, right? No, we need this money now. We need it to get to communities now. We know that to put this money into communities is not only an issue of access and equity, it's actually an issue of durability and practicality, right? In many of these contexts, rule of law is not strong. And frequently, I think the discussion becomes, okay, rule of law is not strong, we can't support this context. The reality is where rule of law is not strong, communities are stronger. And so if the infrastructure is there for people to take care of each other, to manage their finances together, to think about communal space, communal growth together, how do we fund that? So what Home Planet Fund does is we address that in 3 ways: underfunded people, underfunded solutions, underfunded contexts. So underfunded people, we fund directly into IPLC, Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world, right? Sometimes that looks very different in every context, but we fund directly in. We don't fund nonprofits. We don't fund someone in DC who takes 10% off, conservatively, maybe 20%. And then you have someone else who takes 20% off in Nairobi, and by the time it gets to pastoralists in East Africa, it's cents on the dollar. So that's one, underfunded people. Underfunded solutions, we fund what's already been proven out, right? So sometimes we call these nature-based solutions, sometimes we call these just transitions. In reality, it looks quite different in every single context, but the communities have been doing it. Their soil is healthy, their water is clean, they're able to regenerate as they grow food for themselves. And so that proofs out in that context, so we're there to scale and scope at speed. And then 3, underfunded places. Again, getting back to rule of law, there are whole portions of the earth that we think we can't work in because they're not stable enough for us to work in, right? And I challenge that. I come from one of those contexts. I'm Indigenous Polmere from what is now Tajikistan, and I lived through the civil war there. And my family, along with our community, were aid beneficiaries. We received U.S. government food aid during the war. And so to me, I challenge anybody who says their context we can't work in. For us at Home Planet Fund, that's really, really important. And it's important, and the way we're able to do it is we have people like me. We have a board and a staff that is made up of people from all over the world who come from community, who know specific technical aspects. We're also a 501c3, so we have initial seed money. We also have a lot more interest from communities than we can fund right now, so we're a pooled fund mechanism for others who aren't able to hire a staff like us, who don't want to take on the risk or the due diligence of working in a Tajikistan or in a Kenya or even in Afghanistan. But they're like, that's cool. We want to do regenerative agriculture at glacial rivers in Central Asia. So we're going to do that. So that's my answer for now.
Excellent. Well, there's a lot more to dive into in that response, and we will circle back to at least a good portion of it. But Jacqueline, over to you on access. How do you think about that in the context in which you're getting funding out the door?
Thanks so much, Jake. And I think echoing the thanks for the organizers, Maxine, Jolisa, the rest of the BHA team, I'm really excited in this capacity to be having this conversation about financing, in addition to kind of the previous experience I had at USAID leading our climate finance portfolio. Access continues to be one of our biggest challenges. And I think just jumping off from Dilafru's, our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance is specifically targeted towards people who are most vulnerable around the world. So a lot of what we're dealing with is not only the macro, but it's also at the micro level in places that are really hard to reach. I think from a USAID perspective, we do have a $150 billion climate finance target between 2022 and 2030. And within that, different bureaus are working in different ways. And some of the ways that we're looking to get to that and breaking access barriers is, one, working across the interagency, so supporting Treasury colleagues as they engage with the multilateral development funds, as they engage with the likes of the Green Climate Fund, making sure that we are bringing to bear equities of the communities in the fragile states that we represent, but also making sure that there is an understanding of how U.S. government money positively impacts those communities. So for instance, in July, we signed an MOU with the Green Climate Fund, and part of the proponents of that MOU is a focus on access to climate finance for fragile and conflict-affected states to make sure that as they think through their own disbursements around the world, they are prioritizing how to work in countries like Somalia, but also how to make sure that once they get the funding there, if there are additional security challenges, they are able to be flexible and pivot and continue to make sure that the investments that they've committed to the country stay in the country and they don't kind of pull the plug when the pendulum of security or political stabilization shifts. I think another way that we're thinking around issues of access is how can we really be innovative and challenge the system? So we do use blended finance, for instance, and really trying to find ways that USAID's grant money can be put into facilities that we can design to be more flexible. And part of our design process does involve not only getting feedback from across our teams across USAID, but also depending on the type of mechanism we have, we also do have community participation. I think we've heard before from other speakers about the priorities USAID has for localization. And as part of that localization target of having 25% of our funds dispersed to local institutions by 2025, and then 50% of decision-making and co-design and authority to our partners by 2030, a lot of what we're thinking now through innovative finance is taking lessons from what has worked, continuing to iterate and apply it in contexts that are hard, and not really being shy to do that. Part of it is we do see that as our mandate, but part of it is if not us, then who? I think the last part that is really important is, and we talked about it at least on the last panels, just around knowledge. How can we continue to have open avenues of sharing knowledge and exchange? A lot has already been done, and sometimes it tends to be siloed. So for us, that learning agenda, whether it's sharing it with other donors, getting our partners to educate us on how to better serve them, is an important one. From an internal perspective, as far as access, we rely a lot on our USAID missions around the world, and within kind of our internal context, our Foreign Service nationals. They have lots of strong local contacts, local knowledge, and they are really able to help us shape how we can translate U.S. foreign policy and funding into local development priorities in the countries that we operate in. We have a number of policies, and we definitely have a lot of policies, and we continue making more. But I think part of the intention of creating, rethinking, continuing to push ourselves internally and our own policies is really trying to improve. So whether it is social impact risk screening tools, whether it is coming up with a new socioeconomic and environmental accountability mechanism, we have people on a daily basis really trying to figure out how best to apply U.S. taxpayer dollars in places that need it the most, because we know that's where we will get the best foreign policy gains, and that's where we will make the biggest difference in people's lives.
Excellent. So Bella, over to you, to a department that I don't think anybody has ever accused of having not enough policies. and maybe we can extend that into the world of the MDBs. Just thinking, how do you take us from such a enormous scale of available financing and breadth of organizations down into that sort of local, community-led and community-oriented approach for access to finance?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me and the Treasury Department to be at this table and in this event. So I work in something called the Climate Hub at Treasury. We sit right under the Treasury Secretary. We are a small team of policy advisors focusing on setting the strategic direction for Treasury's climate work and coordinating across the Treasury Department, domestic and international, on the climate issues facing the agency. And so what I think is most interesting and why I kind of want to talk a little bit about the hub is because we have this vantage point looking at domestic and international. I think there's a lot to be learned in both directions about the kinds of mechanisms that work. So among other things, the Treasury Department is heavily engaged in the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Most of the spending anticipated via the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is anticipated to happen through tax incentives, which are administered by the Treasury Department. And so we're learning a lot from how some of those incentives and programs are working on the ground domestically. Jake, you mentioned some of them. A lot of the bonus programs, things that are kind of small overlays, and I say that in quotations because the impact they can have is really massive. The low-income communities bonus program, prevailing wage standards that really say, you know, we are trying to drive investment, yes, but we're trying to add that incentive on top of it to make that investment go to the communities that most need it. And I think what we're learning from the IRA is that we can do this, that we can achieve that. We're seeing results all over the country. The IRA is driving investment, more investment to lower income communities, communities with college graduation rates less than the national average, incomes less than national average, higher unemployment rates than average. So we're seeing how these incentives can really work together, and these kinds of programs domestically can drive some of that investment and drive it to the communities that need it most. So then we turn internationally, where the Treasury Department oversees and is responsible in the U.S. government for oversight of many of the multilateral development banks, as well as the multilateral climate funds, among others. And so we're really gaining a lot of experience over the last few years and really innovating. It's not something the Treasury Department is known for, frankly, is innovation, but we have been able to innovate over the last few years to really work with other countries, with partner countries, to increase access to climate finance. I think we look at it in two ways. So one is sort of the big picture, what people refer to as the international financial architecture, which is really just the system of finance. And that system of finance is largely not working for developing countries. They are not getting enough climate finance. Most climate finance is delivered within and to developed countries, not to developing countries. And so what we're looking at is how can we work to evolve and make bigger and better the institutions that are responsible for delivering that finance to developing countries. So the Multilateral Development Bank, Secretary Yellen called a couple years ago for them to evolve, to both free up more resources and then to also deliver them more effectively. And we're starting to really see the fruits of that. The MDBs hit their highest climate finance numbers ever this past year, $74 billion delivered last year for climate. And we are also working through, for example, the G20 to review and to improve the multilateral climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund that Jacqueline mentioned, the Global Environment Facility. How can they do more to better and more effectively channel their very scarce concessional resources to developing countries, to the communities who need it? There's a lot more work to be done. I'm really pleased by this convening and really looking forward to learning from all of you about what are even more of the models that can be used, especially for communities to access climate finance. But I'll stop there for now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bella, for that. And a couple notes embedded in your opening comments, too, that we'll circle back to. But Laura, over to you. Please give us your perspective on this question of access and maybe a little background on your organization.
Sure. Thank you, Jake, and thank you, Maxine, for the invitation. Thank you to the Wilson Center and the White House for this very important conversation that we're having today. I think that we have the advantage, but also the disadvantage that we're the closing panel, because a lot of things have been said. But I also think that I have the advantage, and we do, to just thread a few of the pieces that have happened today. Over the course of today, I have heard numbers such as 50%, 35%, commitments of 45%, pledges of 1.7 billion. But the numbers that I see also in the sector that Global Green Grants work are much closer to 2%, 1%, 0.001%. And I think that this is not a mathematical equivocation of any part. It's not mathematical. It's actually political. And it also, my challenge here is also to respond this question not through technicisms or architectural stuff or bringing here engineers to help us understand what's happening with the access. What's happening with the access, lack of access, and lack of connection is political will. And I think that that political will is translated in our inability and lack of interest in really responding and addressing questions such as, why are we women not showing up in our calls for proposals? Why are organizations not being able to register? Why is it that we are not seeing indigenous folks in this table? And the answer to those, I don't think that is in the interest of many in philanthropy and aid to respond and to address. And I think that that's where our focus needs to be. Obviously, there's a lot of architectural challenges that we can also address. There's a huge bottleneck happening between the supply and the demand of social and environmental justice action and financing. But I think that at the core of this is that we have a collective problem here. And my team will kill me if I don't talk about green grants, but I think it's also my ethical responsibility to speak about why is it that we have today heard beautiful and really empowering and interesting stories about each of our own programs as foundations, but we are still facing the numbers that I mentioned. And so there is an ethical and a responsibility of how accountable are we in the aid sector and in the philanthropic sector of why this is happening. And I think it's happening because we're not answering the type of questions of most activists getting killed and murdered in most countries where climate action is being addressed, people getting jailed, confronted by state capture of corporate powers, unable to register the organizations, unable to access finance, because to be able to access finance, you almost have to hire first an accountant to be able to then report the type of financing restrictions that we're asking. And if we are not able to look frontally at those challenges, the technical solutions are never going to solve it. And we see it also because I feel that one of the problems in philanthropy and aid is that those who are guiding us have huge risk aversion. And they are legal counsel sitting in New York offices telling us how not to do things in a place and in a world of crisis where more and more restrictions to civic spaces is happening, more and more confrontations to the states are happening, because the climate crisis at its core is a political crisis, a social crisis that is confronting power, and power is holding on to power. So if we are not able to at the very least say that we are in a risky business and that we are therefore obliged to do it that way, we're failing since the outset. And I wouldn't feel comfortable here in talking about these financially technical solutions that we need to create unless we start talking about those things. And there's obviously a lot of models that have worked. Juan Carlos is here to speak on behalf of an indigenous-led fund, for example. Lindsay also mentioned the Youth Climate Justice Fund. Green Grants Fund has and this is for my team, Green Grants, Global Green Grants Fund is a decentralized, uses a decentralized mechanism with advisors to be able to access. Most of our grantees are receiving funds for the very first time, and they are unregistered organizations. So we've been learning how to do those things. We have a lot more to learn, but more than that, I think that we all are accountable and responsible for how are we going to address a moment of crisis, of breaking of democracies, closing civic spaces, jailing, criminalization of those who we are saying all day long today are having those solutions. And how come we're not talking about that? That would be my respectful, provocative question for this.
Thank you for that. Indeed, a very worthwhile question. I think we should let's actually dig into that a little bit, because you highlighted sort of the dual nature of the challenge just on the financing side, which is to say that from a global macro perspective, even as we've got MDBs doing $74+ billion in 1 year on climate finance, we need that to experience a step change in growth, because it still only represents, 10, an order of magnitude, or really 2 orders of magnitude less than what the scale of the challenge is when we're talking about $1 trillion scale. But then the secondary and these are both, these shouldn't be interpreted as judgments on of the importance of one or the other. But the additional challenge and crisis that we face is that within that macro scale, we're not getting the financing to the places that really need the financing. And I appreciate your sort of level setting on the actual percentage of financing that is going to communities that we're all talking about here today. But I want to dig into that, and maybe we'll look to the 2 leaders on the stage who are managing funds to help us think about, and this goes back to Dilafruz's just like initial opening gambit of like how the Home Planet Fund is focused on addressing this challenge, but it left me wanting to know more about how exactly do you do that? Like when you talk about going to the places and the people who need it the most, what does that actually mean from an implementation perspective, and what lessons should we be taking from that as we're designing the programs, either at USAID, Treasury, DFC, and Laura, to your point, what have been some of the learnings of your organization that could be scaled in a way to actually mitigate in a real way the challenges that you're highlighting? Because I think that there's no lack of, even as you indicate that this is not just an economic crisis, it's also a political, social economy here that we're working in. I think that we're also in a moment where we have real political leadership that is interested in tackling these problems. And so you've got an audience here who wants to hear what some of the solutions are that we should be doing more of, and growing and amplifying. So, but let me turn it to you first.
Yeah, that was a big question. I think, let me go back to just history setting, right? Assuming that we're all on the same page. So I think 3 data points are really important, or 3 history points are really important. One is that the way we think about development in the U.S. and what we've essentially outsourced to the rest of the world, humanitarian and development, right across the nexus, is a result of the Marshall Plan post-World War II. It was the way the U.S. wanted to be part of the rebuilding of Europe. And so we took that very particular context with the U.S. to Europe relationship, and that has become now the monolithic way in which we think about any kind of working amongst peoples and communities at the international, national, regional, subnational level. That's one. 2, I think the other one is that a lot of that giving has to be directed at US 501c3s, right? Which were built to be a tax code entity. It wasn't built smart to be about nonprofits or working in community or even mutual aid. Like, it was built to be a tax law, right? And then 3, I won't get into the background of the climate crisis. We all know why we're here. We know that it was a very few select groups of people doing very select things, and that's why we're here. We now have inherited all 3 of those systems and structures. And for the most part, I would say, to Laura's point, not to speak for you, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my mind, we are now trying to solve those monolithic problems with the same tools, right? And so I think that's why, for me, the Home Planet Fund, what Laura does, what other people do, is so important, is because we can't use the same tools that originally caused the oppression, that caused the harm, right? And so how do we essentially dismantle some of that? Because we know it's not working. So how do we fix that? So that's kind of where Home Planet Fund is with all of this. I would say, in terms of the how are we able to do it? One, it's really important to have leadership, staff, board members who reflect where you want to work, right? And it can't just be, I really appreciated Juan Carlos said this early, it can't just be those of us who are indigenous, and have access to the US and speak English, right? It would be wonderful if we weren't the only ones straddling. It'd be wonderful if there were other people in this room who could participate, and I would say probably have much more nuance than I could have in this conversation, since I straddle two worlds. So the staffing is important because if I'm trying to work in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, that's a context I know. Those are languages I know. Those are women I can sit with who will tell me things that they wouldn't tell other people. That really matters. That matters on due diligence. That matters on reporting. That matters across the line. It also matters in being able to navigate and finagle your way through, like building good relationships, but like figuring out the grants and et cetera. So I'm going to leave it for Laura, but I say that stuff's really important.
But if you'll just indulge me a minute, just to stick with that. So let's just imagine that we are focused on financing entrepreneurs or program in Tajikistan. Take us through sort of like the instrumental, like what actually are you doing that's kind of dismantling that system that we should be replicating in other markets and other places? How are you reaching those communities? How does it actually, what does it look like from a programmatic perspective for your fund? And like, who can invest in your fund? If I had people in New York and London who are dying to get exposure into climate mitigation, adaptation finance, and they're interested in emerging markets, they're willing to take the risk. To Laura's point, in terms of risk appetite, how do they know about you? How can we help them know about you? What's the sort of the mechanics of it all?
Yeah, well, we have a website, and I'm
Okay.
here right now.
Yep.
The social media team is working quite hard. No. So to that point, like we were private for the first year and a half because we wanted to proof out the carbon sequestration and the biodiversity data, right? We just went public this past April. This past Climate Week, like several weeks ago, was my first time out in public. So thank you all for indulging me in my second public outing. So anyone can donate. Anyone can partner with us. Obviously, we have our own kind of privacy and ethics policies, so we could get into that on the back end, right? But in terms of what it would look like in a Tajikistan, for example, right? One, it matters that we know the context really well. Again, the staffing really matters. Two, it matters that we don't go into a Tajikistan or a Kenya or Tanzania or a Vanuatu, for that matter, and say, this is what we need from you, this is when we need it, and this is how we need it. We go and we sit with those contexts, and we're like, tell us about Tajikistan. Tell us about Vanuatu. What's happening? Who are your neighbors? What's worked? Have you dealt with USAID? Have you dealt with somebody else? What didn't work? What didn't work for you? And for us, our lead out into a project or a program is a really long time because we engage in this relationship building and trust building in context. It's important that it's not one or two conversations. It's not just them telling us what they need initially, but kind of teasing that out, right? Because I'll give the example of East Africa, right? We knew that was important because the grasslands in East Africa are critical to biodiversity. They're critical to carbon sequestration. They're critical for kind of great animal migration and preventing desertification. We knew that context was important. In going there in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, we met lots of different government agencies, but we also met tribes. And we realized that the inherent tension between governments and tribes. And so we started working with the tribes and understanding the local context. That context in the last 2 years has changed. We have partners who have now fled from one country to another, can't continue the programs they were so dedicated to. And so our ability to be flexible and say, you know what, we understand, like, you're a human, you live in a holistic world in which now you're having to escape, now we're having to think about legal entities. And so I think just the paradigm of we don't go into a context to tell them what to do, and we really try to build, and then as things shift, as people have to flee, we really try to support that whole entity. And we're never reliant on one community or one person in a community. We work kind of across communities and across tribes so that it's that democratization, but also that pluralism of approach.
Yeah, okay. Laura, tell us a little bit more about your approach and sort of the how and the implementation side of the grants program.
Sure. It's very similar to what Dilafros was saying. I think that at the core of being able to access the type of groups and communities that you're talking about, we need to give them and offer them, from philanthropy or aid, unrestricted, multi-year funding, community-controlled capital, flexible, intersectional, trust-based. And I know that I'm throwing a lot of words out there. The meaning and what's behind it makes things possible. Otherwise, the opposite of those concepts start creating the distance that we're now trying to solve. So I think that that also requires a flexible approach to understanding that climate action cannot be restricted to carbon measurements or to those type of technological solutions that do not address the fact that the climate crisis is a crisis in racism, lack of access, colonialism, commodity of nature, harm, abuse. And if we don't start understanding that communities are actually doing those things, and therefore our funding needs to provide that, then we're just restricting communities and restricting grantees to do something that Lindsay was mentioning before, which is short-term solutions instead of this longer-term approach and I think that that's the biggest risk of all. I find it really interesting that in risk-averse entities or philanthropies, they think about risk of not gaining or ensuring the short-term solution. So you create programs where you are able to just measure what you can do in a year, but then you forget that the biggest risk of all that you're taking with that approach is that you don't have any way to guarantee any longer-term solutions and any longer-term impact. Because if you ask that risk-averse foundation, what's going to happen to that type of program once your intermediary and your Washington-based organization, with all due respect of the ones that might be here, goes, and the community did not own that capital, did not control those solutions, you have zero impact in 15 years, zero. That is the biggest risk of all. And I think that's the question that I would like to pose to all those legal counsels that are guiding these donors.
Yeah, no, this is really, really helpful. And I think what you've identified, and De La Cruz, what you've identified in terms of flexibility, in terms of meeting communities where they are, that speaks a lot. And I want to go back to Jacqueline and Bella, because it speaks a lot to something that Jacqueline started out saying when she said that we're challenging the system. And you then pivoted to sort of the work that USAID was doing on blended finance. But talk to us about how you think about sort of breaking down those conventions around the typical restrictions that you find. And I can tell you from experience, and I'm looking at Aparna, who she and I were attached at the hip for 3 years in trying to help the sort of major institutional capital allocators in the world who are worried about risk and who are worried about political turmoil and who are worried about the types of things that you would be worried about if you had a fiduciary responsibility to create growth in your fund over a certain period of time. How do you speak that language and translate that back via USAID or the hub, where I see those as key channels for that kind of translation, really, in terms of speaking both languages?
Tough question. First of all, I'll say it's hard and we don't completely have it figured out, right? It's an evolving process, but I'm really excited because our different teams are trying to figure it out. And so one example, for instance, is actually a collaboration with the DFC, where we challenged a lot of the DFC's investments in climate and particularly into fragile and conflict-affected states. And when we asked the question, why aren't you investing more, we got the response of, it's too risky, we can't go in that country, the credit ratings are too low, and all of the other indicators. So what we came up with as a solution was, through our two main mechanisms at USAID, grants and technical assistance, we can provide DFC with a couple of people at the DFC with the development experience as well as with the finance experience to think through, how do you invest in these harder contexts? how do you come up with an investment thesis that makes sense to the DFC board and actually pass that through? So that's something that's going on right now that we're really excited about. And we're not going to see gains immediately, but it's one that we think that from a USG perspective, over time, building out the capacity within DFC to look at proposals in Mozambique, but not only in southern Mozambique, but to really start thinking about northern Mozambique where it is more fragile. Same thing as Cote d'Ivoire, not to invest in Abidjan, but really to think about the border region where we are starting to see a little bit more fragility and starting to use finance as a means of bringing about stability, I think is a key priority from our end. I think another aspect that I think is quite important that we've kind of pushed the barriers on is this question of multi-year funding. Within USAID, BHA does have multi-year grants, in part because of our acknowledgement of the fact that in a lot of the places we work, by the time we actually get the money there, something else might have happened or the context might be different. And so that has also been kind of one of the special tools that my team has that really forces us to plan in a different way, but that's not focused on getting immediate results, but that's really focused on the long term. But one of the key priorities, at least of our administrator, is also like forcing us to think through the humanitarian development nexus and really kind of saying, yes, my job is really to make sure when there is an emergency, we are able to go in and provide an immediate solution. And then we almost hand over the baton to different parts of USAID to carry on the support. But how can we do so in a way that better sequences and layers and integrates the work of humanitarian action of really providing maize, wheat, the day after a disaster, to later helping those communities with aspects of regenerative agriculture to make sure that they are self-sustaining later. Once again, it takes time, and it's one that we are working through, but one that I think that from a development community that, was rooted in the Marshall Plan, but that has since evolved to consider the fact that the world has changed and the communities where USAID in particular is working is still an evolving context. So whether we are talking about youth pushing back on the establishment and asking for more, or whether we are talking about the impacts of climate, we are figuring out how to be more systemic in our approaches to our programming, but also to try and better just plan. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Burkina Faso and Mali, for instance, and they have just experienced the worst flooding in about 2 decades. So going out to rice paddies that were just completely washed away. And one of the conversations we're starting to have there is, yes, we are providing immediate aid in communities where we can get aid to safely, but what happens when the water recedes? How can we then move from that immediate corn aid to then working with our partners like the World Food Program and others to support communities that are in safer areas to come up with solutions that in the long term help prepare them. One of the ways that we see is important is around data and technology. So our colleagues at FuseNet help us think through and map and track data about weather predictive patterns. But equally, for us, it's important to make sure that we get the big data that we understand and what we know will happen as far as weather patterns to people's phones. And really getting from that macro to the micro is one that we think is important and obviously still work to be done. But we think it's really important that in the long term, people are able to understand and actualize that if there is a problem coming, there are solutions to that. So just as an example, we have funded a parametric insurance providers, so insurance providers that use that predictive technology that are able to provide insurance to farmers when they know that something is going to come, so that the farmers reduce their vulnerability. And we see that connection between information technology, but also kind of community understanding of their own situation about how best to program is really important. So the last thing that I'll say is really, for an institution like ours, we typically support, the UN system, large international NGOs in part because it has been seen as the way to provide that accountability and the transparency. We know that they are not the only solution, and so we are slowly going, okay, in this context, absolutely, the UN makes sense, but in a context like Sudan, where they are not able to have full access to the country, maybe it does make sense for us to work through emergency response rooms for people who are providing not only grain, but who are cooking meals for people within their own communities, and understanding that that's where impact will be. But to change the full system, I think will take time. It has taken time, but it is kind of the continuous chipping at the process and evolution and innovation within public service that I think will get us there.
Yeah.
But the last thing though, U.S. government definitely has a lot of money and has a lot of interest, but I think that we also need to be cognizant that the aid structure and model in the U.S. and elsewhere is changing. A lot of the stereotypical donors are reducing their aid budgets, and so I think that is forcing all of us to really figure out what do new partnerships look like moving forward, be it the private sector, be it innovative business models, but even ourselves, really thinking of ourselves not only as grantors, but as catalyzers, because we are not going to be the sole solution to solving a lot of these really pressing, really hard problems.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot about the context of the multilateral system in that regard, because there you've got institutions that are focused on being catalysts, de-risking, also that are set up to work locally. You don't have to be a U.S. 501c3 to receive funding from the African Development Bank, or even take it down a layer to a more regional development bank like the Trade Development Bank in East Africa. How should we be thinking about that ecosystem, Bella, in terms of providing some of those innovative flexibilities and greater appetites for risk in terms of their deployment of capital?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think this all points to there's this fundamental mismatch where, like, the big pools of money, the global savings are all in big pension funds. They're in financial institutions, mostly in the global north. No, they're not all. And the need of communities, and when I've talked to communities or colleagues who are working really closely with communities, they can't reach the scale of that is needed to try to go out and get this money sitting in these big pools. They are getting out-competed by better resourced organizations. They don't necessarily have the technical capacity and bandwidth to meet all of the quality standards which, the lists of which get longer and longer. And they don't, especially in the climate space, don't always have the technical backgrounds to be able to establish the narrative that funders are looking for. And I think that this mismatch in the finance space is just fundamental to addressing. And I think that the multilateral institutions are really important as being part of that value chain of getting from big global savings down to communities. They're definitely not the whole chain. They're definitely not the only part of that chain. And I think, one thing that we've worked on at Treasury over the last few years is working with these multilateral development banks and institutions to play a role to figure out better how they can activate the full vertical chain of funding. So on one side, how can they better access and get more from the global pool of savings? So working, for example, with the Inter-American Development Bank, their IDB Invest, they've just approved a new model where they're going to be able to raise more capital from the global pension funds through a originate to share model, which I won't bore you with the details of, but I'm happy to talk to you more about that later if you're interested. So that's sort of like, how do they access it there? And then how do they actually deliver it in ways that are more targeted to communities that need that? And there are a lot of different models that are being developed there. I think there's plenty more work to be done there. One of those models is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are about working at a national level to bring in more of the national country-driven voice, to bring in national development banks, subnational development banks. Those are institutions that are much closer to the needs of in countries, to bring in civil society and to develop a platform to better deliver finance in a less fragmented way, which is another, I think, very reasonable complaint of a lot of developing countries, that there are a million different funds and they don't necessarily have time to apply to them all. Can they just be delivered better as a package? The Just Energy Transition Partnerships are intended to be able to do that. So I think those kinds of platforms are really important. They're also working more with funds and blended funds on the ground. And this is something that I worked at a lot at CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, which is where I was before Treasury, where we were running for 10 years. It's still running a global innovation lab for climate finance, where we were working with emerging market entrepreneurs, both companies, finance types, to actually help them develop new innovative financial models to be able to deliver financing, to work more closely with communities that they were much more familiar with than anybody living and working far removed from those countries, those communities. And so we really worked to help them actually figure out how to piece together finance from this MDB or that MDB with this bilateral financial institution, with USAID, with the Green Climate Fund, with maybe some domestic family offices in their country, and actually bring that all together into a fund or facility that could then work more closely with communities. I think intermediaries like what the two of you are doing, this is the bridges are what we should all be looking for. We need to build bridges in the financial system as well. And I think figuring out how to work with intermediaries, how to build those bridges, and how to do it in a way that channels finance much more effectively and efficiently is just really important going forward.
Yeah, good. I would like to just note for the record that I had a very structured set of questions. I think Laura sort of took us in a different direction, but a good one. But Bella has taken us back to one question, I think, that we'd originally planned on getting into a little bit, which is this layer, this sort of intermediate layer that comes in many different forms, one of which is not represented at the table, but I think is really important, which is the world of philanthropic capital. And we've sort of implicitly invoked that world a little bit here today in terms of blending finance and thinking about risk-taking. And I want to go back to Laura and then open it up to anybody else who wants to comment. But how should we be thinking about better aligning the world of philanthropic capital towards these goals and sort of broader strategic initiatives that can help ultimately to bring more financing into the ecosystem?
Sure. That was actually the question that I didn't prepare. But I want to tackle it by just mentioning what I mentioned in passing in the beginning, which is the bottleneck that exists between these huge investments of capital that are growing. They're not necessarily walking the talk in terms of climate financing, but then this immense, vast, and rich ecosystem of action that is happening in the communities, despite the fact that they're not receiving money. So this is just a note or a footnote to just say that's where the power lies. They don't even need the money to do that, but they actually do need the money to be able to succeed even better. This bottleneck, in many ways, is already getting solved, but is still unseen by these huge amounts of capital. And it's getting solved by the creation many years ago, and this is increasing now, the creation of many community-led movement accountable funds that are tackling what we need to tackle, which is from the proximity of the movements that they are supporting. They're not only able to resolve that financial challenge that you're talking about, Jake, but they're able to resolve something that is super important. That is, communities thrive much more when you give them access to financing, but when you accompany them throughout the journey. And you accompany them closely by responding to what De La Cruz was saying, which is, in northern Tanzania, people are fleeing because of land conflicts, so they're not able anymore to do the project that they first told you about when you gave them a fund. So you need that type of flexibility in your own systems to be able to do it. But even with that type of thriving ecosystem, I do think that we need to think about something that we experience in Green Grants every day, which is that I challenge the concept of intermediary funds, because if we are only seen as that bridge of money, and we are limited and we continue to get this type of larger funds in a restricted way, then it means that the sector is not investing in its own infrastructure that is needed precisely to democratize and redistribute funding. And by that, what I mean is Green Grants, as well as many other of our partner funds, local philanthropies, indigenous-led funds, are not getting what they need to be able to succeed as partners in this endeavor of access and the lack of access that we just have been speaking about. What do we need? We need flexible, core, multi-year funding to be able to offer the same to the movements. And as much as we are in many, many ways alchemists of all of that, because we are the cushion to the risk to the donors, what we're doing actually, which is a lot more risky, we're the cushion to provide a lot more unrestricted funding from the restricted funds that we get. We cannot do that. We cannot do so much of that. There's a limit to our capacities as public foundations who need the larger climate investing in order to then allow for philanthropy to have a real chance at making some change and some contribution to addressing the climate crisis. And for that, I think we really seriously need to pay into consideration. And I think that one of the challenges that I feel is happening is a little bit like a cultural mindset where people with more money think that they have, therefore, a larger voice and the power to direct, and therefore they see us as very small grantees and not really like partners in actions to make philanthropic investments meaningful and impactful. And the same obviously goes to the communities that we're supporting. If we don't truly acknowledge from the outset that the action is there, that human capacity far exceeds in power what money can do, then we're still commodifying all of that, and we're still structuring it in a way that it will always be top-down. And it will never have the ability to reimagine a different world, start constructing it differently, and really start addressing the climate crisis, which is enormously challenging. And if we do that in the wrong mindsets, then as much as we can think and rethink of architectural schemes, I don't think it's going to be impactful.
Well, for a question that you didn't prepare a response to, I would say you nailed it. We're running out of time. Do you want to come in, Jacqueline?
Yeah, I think also just sharing a little bit perhaps about what we're doing at USAID to try and bridge this, because we have come up with, I think, some innovative solutions. One is through the Climate Finance for Development Accelerator, which is a USAID mechanism where we create different windows of funding to try and address some of these challenges. About a year and a half to two ago, one of the challenges we identified was actually funding females within the climate space and recognizing that the amount of money for climate solutions going to women was less than 2%. So we came up with a facility called the Climate Gender Equity Fund, specifically focused at women-led institutions and or institutions focusing on women-focused issues within the climate space. And through that, and this is why I thought it was important to highlight that for us, it was not only about us as USAID, it was making sure that we had the support of philanthropy, that we had the support of corporates as well, not only to put their money into this fund that we would then onward fund, but also using it as a platform to bring women's voices into the room when we were having climate conversations and start to shift how we have the conversation about gender and climate. I think another one that I would like to highlight is the fact that we, as USAID, BHA, are supporting the UN Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and that is specifically focused on women-led organizations in countries that are more fragile. So just highlighting Ethiopia and South Sudan and really trying to build upon local systems, institutions, and knowledge, but particularly women's leadership to try and bring that voice into the humanitarian and climate sector, where it's been even less prominent than before. And I think one thing, at least looking at the uprising in Sudan a couple of years ago, one of the positive highlights of that was women's leadership in that. And so that's something that we are also trying to support and fund and highlight, but making sure that when women are not adequately represented, we find ways to bring women, youth, and other historically marginalized and currently marginalized people to the table. Because unless they are in the rooms, we can give the money, as you said, but they actually need to be there to help shift how we're viewing, how we're funding, and how we're making policy for their lives.
Excellent. Well, Jacqueline, I think we'll leave it at that because we have exhausted time on this panel. I want to just offer one note because I know one of the things that we're focused on is making sure that we take these insights and the insights that this whole group developed over the course of the day and input that into a process to take this forward and to concretize a lot of the important concepts and sort of mandates that I think have emerged from this discussion. I have taken copious notes. I would highlight just like a few things around flexibility, around long-term mechanisms and vehicles, around pulling in philanthropic capital, but in a way that is consultative with local communities and local knowledge, and particularly breaking down some of the barriers that that sometimes create accessibility problems for that local knowledge, ranging from language to legal capacity to project preparation. And I think I want to sort of I felt inspired by the phrase of challenging the system that Jacqueline started off with. I think that it's kind of funny to be deep within the system and extolling that sentiment, but I think that's where we are. So we'll leave it there, and I just want to say thank you again to this really excellent group of leaders on stage. You guys we're looking to you, and we hope that you will let us know what we can do better and more of or less of, and we've got your back. So just let us know how we can help, and thank you again. And thanks to the Wilson Center and to Jolisa and to Maxine and the whole crew. Really appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maxine Burkett, Assistant Director for Climate, Ocean, and Equity at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. If this work has taught me anything, it is that our challenges, aspirations, and our futures are interconnected. Climate change is personal and it is also local. That is why we remain steadfast in our efforts to safeguard communities, accelerate adaptation, and continue to fund and expand innovative funding mechanisms to ensure inclusive climate solutions are in fact a reality. I now have the great privilege to introduce our final speaker of the day, someone who has epitomized that commitment to every community and who has led pioneering initiatives within the White House and across our country with that spirit of interconnection. Brenda Mallory is the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. She's committed her entire career to public service and among many other achievements under her leadership of CEQ. We've seen significant firsts in the effort to advance environmental justice and inclusive climate action. On a personal note, she's also been a role model and a mentor who demonstrates the kind of engaged and thoughtful leadership needed at this critical time. Chair Mallory, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
I was hoping you weren't going to be stuck there. Yeah, hello everyone. It's a real honor to be here this afternoon, and I'm always so grateful when I'm able to come in just a few minutes before I'm speaking and hear the folks before me. That was just a fabulous panel, and actually evidence of obviously what a good and fulsome day you all have had, just listening to thoughtful people and discussions like that. So I'm thrilled to be closing you out. I hope you aren't all too ready for the bar. I'll try to be quick. I think that, first of all, thank you so much, Maxine, for even inviting me to join in this program. This idea of us having a kind of domestic and global effort going on and their ability to intersect and learn from each other, I think is really critical. So I was really pleased to be able to be part of this. And it's always a pleasure to join when we're talking about advancing equitable climate action across the United States and with our partners. I mean, that is so critical to the work that we are doing at the Council on Environmental Quality. And I think that the last 3.5 years working under this president and this vice president who have so centered this work in the administration has been a true privilege. I regularly say that President Biden and Vice President Harris are advancing the most ambitious climate, conservation, and environmental justice agenda in history. And it's kind of great to say that and know that it's not hyperbole. I mean, it is just, those are just the facts. And that includes a clear commitment to strengthening our nation's global leadership in the fight against climate change as well as other issues. The Biden-Harris administration has also recognized the need to safeguard just basic protections, clean air, clean water, creating a kind of healthy environment. And that really stems from, I think, a core belief by both the president and the vice president that those are just basics that we should all be able to count on, and that has not been our reality. So how do we fix that? How do we change that? So I love the challenge, the system comment. I wrote that down. That'll definitely be part of my remarks. Over the past 4 years, President Biden and Vice President Harris have also focused on leading by example on the global stage. And one of the programs that is also run out of the Council on Environmental Quality is our sustainability program. And so we've done a lot of work across the government and with our partners kind of across the globe in emphasizing the important role that we can play as leaders, as operational leads across the government in the work that we are doing both domestically and globally. And so just really just privileged to have a president and a vice president who are so focused on setting the stage for that. Through the Investing in America agenda, which is basically the president's achievement in getting funding to support all of our great efforts. I mean, we have always had a lot of great ideas. We haven't always had money. And through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, we've been able to actually have generational investments go behind some of the ideas and some of the approaches that we believe are so important in this work, and has enabled us to really invest in rebuilding our nation's infrastructure, in advancing clean energy, a clean energy economy, and then tackling climate change while centering environmental justice as an important component of all of that. And the investments that we have delivered have put the United States on track to hit the president's goal of achieving the net zero emissions by 2050. a lot of hard work to make that happen, but I think we're still moving forward and encouraged by some of the progress that we've made so far. But central to all of that, and I think key to the conversation you've all been having here today, is the Justice 40 initiative, which was the president's commitment at the beginning of the administration that we would aim to direct 40% of the overall benefits of our federal climate, clean energy, affordable housing, sustainable, clean transit, that those investments and the overall benefits that they provide would go to communities that are underserved, that have historically been missed out on the federal investments of that type. And so right now across the federal government, there are 19 federal agencies implementing 500 different programs that are under the Justice 40 initiative. And the result of that is that there is more than $600 billion that are flowing under these programs that are under Justice 40 initiative, and making real progress in actually changing that paradigm in terms of federal funding reaching disadvantaged communities. So we feel good about our start, but we also are very aware of the work that needs to be done to further implement both our goals, but also the success on the ground, the actual changes in community members' lives. We've also finalized strong regulations during this administration that have been focused on combating pollution at the source, helping ensure that all communities have clean air and clean water. And that includes stronger clean air standards for chemical plants, a ban on asbestos, the first national standard to address PFAS or forever chemicals in our drinking water, among a number of others. And so the integration of our regulatory program with our other initiatives has really been a key part of our looking at how do we improve the lives of communities on the ground. This past summer, the Biden-Harris administration brought together community leaders, health experts, faith leaders, academics, federal agency representatives, and senior officials across the government for our first White House Summit on Environmental Justice in Action. And that was really an inspiring event for us because we had a number of the community members and leaders come in and talk about the ways in which the funding was really changing things in their communities, often on issues where they had been working for some time but struggling because there wasn't sufficient funding to actually allow for some of the projects to be done, and feeling the real difference in having an administration that was investing in the communities in a way that was really building kind of healthier environments for all. So a couple of good examples for you. We heard from Stephen Rowe Lewis, who is the governor of the Gila River Indian community, who told us about how the funding from the President's Investing in America agenda is going to help construct and install solar panels over the Casablanca Canal, and that this project is powering homes and businesses while shading and protecting our water sources. We also heard from Abel Olivio, who talked about leveraging federal funding to expand its tree ambassador program to build bilingually educated people about the benefits of trees, growing native trees, creating jobs around trees, and providing community programming. And these were just two of the many stories that we both heard and collected. And I recommend that you can go on our website, environmentaljustice.gov, and actually see the program, but also see some of the examples of other work that's gone on across the country that's allowing us to kind of advance environmental justice and this notion of a just energy transition here in the United States. So, as I said, more work to do, but our environmental justice priorities are things that we feel are important and extend kind of beyond our borders, and they're integral to the full scope of the U.S. government's work, both domestically and globally. And that's why the work that you are doing here and the forum that you are conducting has been so important, and really speaks about how the President's executive order on tackling the climate crisis, both home and abroad, has really provided a model for a lot of the work that's been done over the last 3.5 years, and really answering the President's call to take action and to center the most vulnerable and historically underserved communities in our global climate efforts. And what I loved hearing about from the previous panels, just the ways in which you take a policy idea, an objective, and then scale it in ways and down to the level where you know the adjustments that you have to make in order to make that reality come true. So it's great to have a notion, and we got to start there, but it really takes the adjustments that our previous panel was talking about in order to actually see that effectuated on the ground. And I think the administration and a lot of the work that we've done is recognizing that and understanding that for a lot of the policies, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, that you really do have to assess how you achieve that goal in a particular place or a particular region in order to actually achieve the overall success. And so, that's both challenging and exciting, because it does mean that there is a sense that at a kind of place-based way, in a place-based way, we can all work together around the goals that we're trying to achieve. President Biden and Vice President Harris's ambitious domestic and climate and environmental justice agenda offers the global community a proven model for how bold and equitable climate solutions can grow an equitable, clean energy economy, uplift underserved communities, and deliver good-paying jobs, energy security, and savings for families and businesses. And I think if you've heard the President speak at all, he always talks about the job element, which in his mind is just critical to sort of being able to create circumstances in which people not only benefit in the immediate term, but also kind of sort of advance a future that allows the families and communities to continue to thrive, and that's a critical part of this. So, we've had the power to turn today's global challenges into tomorrow's opportunities, and if we can work together, we can build a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable world for generations to come. And I know just in the little bit I heard that is the mindset that's in this room. And I also know that just knowing who's on this list and looking around this room, some familiar faces, that there is a dedicated group of people who are really looking for ways in which they can work together in order to achieve these goals for all communities in ways that actually overcome some of the issues that we have been less successful in the past, but that we have an opportunity going forward to ensure that we are serving all communities. So I thank you for what you're doing. I thank you for your partnership, for those of you who are working directly with us or with other members of the administration, and please continue what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair Mallory, for that powerful close to a really remarkable day and for your leadership. Before we end the forum today, I want to take a moment just to appreciate the immense thought leadership, expertise, and attention to detail required for these kinds of events. Thank you again to Maxine Burkett and Kate Mason from OSTP, Jolisa Brooks from USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and to my colleagues at the Wilson Center. I'm not going to list you all, but to the many programs that also co-sponsored today's event, because this is not an environmental issue, it's a global issue, right? And so we had a number of our regional programs co-sponsoring the event. Our external relations team, though, I am going to name them because they work like fast and furious and patiently behind the scenes. So thank you very much, Casey Breitenbeck, Larnie Reyes, Keen McBride, John Milewski, Tracy Fitzgerald, and Treyon Burgess for your help today and every day. Thank you to our speakers and our moderators for the insights that you shared today and for the work that you are doing every day. And finally, thank you to those of you in the room. And we had about 600 people watching online from around the world. And I just want to say that the success of these convenings hinge on those audience members listening and taking the gems forward into their daily work. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm going to note that we have a weird situation this afternoon where the power to the building is being shut off in about 45 minutes. So we have to take a pretty quick exit. Normally we would say, stay, have a conversation, have another cup of coffee, but we can't do that today. So I'm going to have to ask you to take a pretty quick exit from the room. For our speakers and panelists, if you could stick around for one last photo op, that would be fantastic. And again, thank you very much.